Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ask on CYC. So love, the most powerful emotion, more powerful than the Russian, American and Chinese army put together. However, it can be altered by something so small and so silly within a relationship. Due to our differences and uniqueness as human beings, or even just male and female. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about how to have positive impact in our relationship and keys to have good relationships. So we have with us today Christian counselor Ireni. Attia. Welcome to the show, Ireni.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I just want to remind the viewers that if you don't ask the question, you're not going to know the answer. And today's show is about you ask and we answer it for you live on the show tonight. And remember, you'll remain anonymous. So the phone number is 0416 551 292. So Ireni, so before we get into the show, give us a little background about yourself so the audience can know who you are.
Okay, so I'm a Christian counsellor. I studied counselling almost 10 years ago now, and I've been practicing counselling for that time. And I've been involved in a lot of parenting seminars and as well as relationship seminars, which I believe is what we're talking about tonight, relationships. And I also work at one of the Coptic schools counselling the children and the families there a couple of days a week.
Okay. So before we get into the show, the next question I'm going to ask you, it's a question that needs 20 episodes for just alone. But I want to ask you, what are the simple differences between male and female?
You really want me to tell you the differences between men and women?
Yes, please. We'll try to keep it in one episode.
Okay. Well, we won't talk about the physical differences because they're obvious.
Sure.
But men and women are certainly different. We're different in the way that we think, and we're different in the way that we go through stress and process stress and difficult times. We're sometimes different even in the way that we express emotion. If you think of, I guess, the male brain and the female brain, a great analogy that's been put out there are waffles and spaghetti. So for the most part, men can generally focus and concentrate and perform one task at a given time and think about that task in isolation, and hence the reference to the waffle with the boxes. So they have various boxes and they can think about any given thing in isolation at that time. Whereas if we think about the bowl of spaghetti as a reference to a woman's brain, when a woman feels or thinks about something, it's often related to many other aspects in her life. So for example, if a situation happens at work, she can easily relate it to something that happened in her childhood, something that happened in the past, even something within the context of her own marriage. So everything is related and everything connects with other things in her world. I guess that's one difference. And the other major difference is how we cope with stress. For a lot of men, they share problems and they share stresses with other people for two primary reasons. Either because they want to get advice, because that person has greater expertise than they do, or they want to show the other person that they may have made a mistake or have some fault in the problem that they're sharing with them. Generally, they feel that if they were to share with their wife or their partner or their fiancé or whatever the case may be, a problem, then they're placing unnecessary burden on their wife or their fiancé. So they tend not to do that. They try to process problems, resolve them first, and then at a later time share that problem with their wife or their fiancé. Women are the complete opposite. Women will share problems, not necessarily always for the sake of achieving a solution, but because that's the way they connect with other people. And when they share problems and they talk about them, that's their opportunity to connect with their husband or connect with their fiancé and be able to share those things. They're not generally looking for advice or criticism, they just want that connection. And so, again, there are differences. And unfortunately, those differences, if they're not understood and appreciated by both husband and wife in a marriage or fiancé and fiancée in a relationship, then it can lead to problems. Sure. They're two of the many differences, but I'm guessing they're the two that you're probably alluding to.
Okay. Just wanted to understand, what are the basic needs for couples to maintain a healthy relationship?
It's very hard to define the needs for a couple in terms of maintaining a healthy relationship in a few, but we certainly have a hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow talked about that hierarchy of needs as being physical needs and all the way to spiritual needs and kind of everything in between. But in terms of marriage, men and women do have distinctly different needs or a different priority of those needs. The problem though happens when those needs are unmet or unsaid, so they remain unmet. Unfortunately, a lot of people grow up with the belief that if I ask for my need to be met and then it's met, it doesn't mean anything because I've asked for it. And the reality is, a lot of the times, both husband and wife, or two people in a relationship, are unaware that that particular thing is a need for the other person. So I think we need to overcome that thinking that if I ask for something or if I state my need, then it's meaningless when it's met. I think we need to be honest and open. So I think the primary thing in terms of relationship is that ability to be honest and open and be willing to hear what the other person has to say in terms of their needs or what they believe their needs are from the relationship.
Sure. So every case, it's a different case.
I think there are common needs across all couples, and men and women do have different needs, but individually as a couple, there is certainly the need to talk about them. Because for some couples, they may have some needs that are naturally met that they don't need to discuss, while others require more of their time and more of their attention and more of their open discussion for them to negotiate a healthy way of meeting them for each other.
Sure. Okay, I want to ask you, in terms of physical attraction, I know a lot of people say it's not important, and the truth is it's what's inside. But let's be realistic here. Is physical attraction important?
I think the question is not whether or not physical attraction is or isn't important, but where it is in terms of that we were talking about earlier, hierarchy of needs or hierarchy of importance. What is it that I'm really looking for in terms of the person that I want to marry or the person that I want to get to know or the person I'd even contemplate getting to know? If physical attraction is first on my list, then I think there's an issue. Because when that happens, and when that has happened in the past, people enter into relationships with that being as their primary focus and that being the most important thing. They then later on discover that the thing that stays and perseveres through the relationship is not the physical attributes of the person, but rather their personality, their ethics, their values, their faith. And I think we can't say that physical attraction is not important, but I think the issue is where it is in terms of priority. It's not something that can be at the very top of our priority list when we're thinking about a future partner, because that can be a mask for a lot of other things and that are far more important and are much more important in a long-term relationship than an outward appearance. It's also important to note that in a lot of seminars we do talk about physical attraction. We talk about actually one of men's needs of having an attractive spouse. And we talk about that not in the context of, again, physical appearance, but about how a person feels about themselves. So generally when a person feels good about themselves and has a positive self-esteem, that's projected through their smile, through their appearance, through the way they present themselves and through the way they interact with others. And when someone doesn't feel too good about themselves, that comes across, both men and women. So that physical attraction certainly plays a role, but it can't be the one and only factor that we enter into a relationship for.
Sure. I remember I was looking at this issue in terms of the Bible, and I remember I came across this, maybe my interpretation is wrong, but when God created Eve for Adam and he first laid his eyes on her, there was some sort of excitement in his speech. I don't know, this is my interpretation. It could show that she was attractive. And
it may, and
yeah.
I think we'd be wrong to not think that that is an element. It is certainly an element, but I think it's a lot of the times it's born out of how she felt about herself and how she presents herself. And the same is true for him also, in terms of a lot of times a woman will be attracted to a man who presents himself well, who has a positive self-image and a positive view of himself, because he'll also help her feel good about herself. It's very difficult to be attracted to someone who feels poorly about themselves, because that comes across.
Sure. Okay, just a reminder to our viewers, please, if you have a question that you want to ask, the phone number is 0416 551 292. If you don't ask, you won't find out the answers. Please send us your questions or give us a call and speak to our Christian counsellor here tonight. So my next question for you is it possible for couples to get bored of each other? For example, when they first met, his jokes were funny and she loved his jokes and he was a funny guy. But after they got married, he stopped being funny. So the reason I want to ask this question is whether it's comic humor or it can be his interesting facts or his intellect and it just dies off. How can a couple keep things interesting in their relationship so they don't go through this dry face?
I think what often happens is, again, as we talk about in a lot of relationship seminars, is that opposites attract. What normally happens is someone with a very popular, outgoing, bubbly, extroverted personality attracts someone to him or herself that's quieter, that has maybe a more peaceful or precise personality, where they're happy to kind of sit and listen to the jokes and enjoy being entertained by their popular personality, husband or wife. What happens over time, though, is, well, life happens over time, really, and things start to get in the way. And one of the things that starts to get blurry in a relationship is intentions. And so we've come up with this idea or this theory that's called conception of intention. And it talks about how I feel about the other person's intentions, or what I believe the other person's intentions are. And one of the worst things that can happen in a relationship is when we start to believe that the other person doesn't have my best intentions in heart. So when, for example, he makes a joke and he's normally bubbly and outgoing, and I start to think that maybe that joke has something to do with me, or it's hurtful, or it's mean, or it's insensitive to how I'm feeling at that point in time, I've moved away from receiving his personality in a loving, accepting way, and I've moved to a place where I'm questioning his intentions towards me. And once I do that, that can then start to erode many aspects of the relationship. I can then start to question things like, for example, if I asked him to come home at a certain time and he's late, I can then start to say, well, maybe he's late because he doesn't care about me, because he doesn't respect my appointments, because he doesn't respect the time that I need to leave. As opposed to knowing that for him to get home at that particular time, for example, would have taken effort from him. And I would be thinking, I appreciate the fact that he left his work early to come at this particular time so I could go to my appointment. His behaviour hasn't changed, but my concept of his intentions towards me has changed. Him has changed, rather. And that affects how I treat him, how I view him, and how I feel about him. And ultimately, it affects the dynamics in the relationship.
So it's not his jokes that are not funny, it's her perception of him that changed, or?
Possibly. That's sometimes the case. Sometimes the case is that it's not so much whether the jokes are funny or not, or he's gone from someone who's got great money management skills to becoming very stingy, or she's become someone who was very accurate and had a precise personality to someone who's pedantic, and she's always asking him to put the towels perfectly lined up the way that they should be. And it can quickly move from something that was positive into something that was negative. To keep those things in a positive thing, we really need to learn to appreciate the differences that we have, and to see them as differences, not as things that are there so that the other person is out to get us because of them. She's not deliberately frustrating you or trying to annoy you by putting the towels in that way, or he's not deliberately trying to make your life difficult by ensuring that your finances are managed properly, because that was once something that you were attracted to him for, or you were attracted to her for. And it's when those intentions become blurry and murky that we then start to make those assumptions about the reasons that the other person is doing something. And a lot of times those assumptions are not true.
Sure. So in terms of compatibility, so if a person, before entering a marriage, or what should a person be looking for to know whether they're actually compatible with each other before they move into that next step?
I think it's important to know that all relationships go through stages, and every relationship goes through these stages. Not all relationships go through them in a perfect linear order, but they do go through them. And the majority of relationships go through an initial stage of attraction and romance and affection. And that stage is important because that stage forms the basis of memories that they need to come back to later in life when things become problematic. But unfortunately, in that stage, a lot of couples have rosy-coloured glasses on, and they think that the world is wonderful and that everything is great. And sometimes they fail to see those differences until they enter into the next stage, which is a power struggle stage, where issues start to come up where they actually are different and they see things differently. And that's bound to happen for the most compatible and the most incompatible of couples, because they're raised in different home environments, they've had a different upbringing, they've had different experiences in life. So naturally those experiences are going to be different, and they're going to have discussions about things that they don't necessarily agree about. How they come out of that power struggle stage and how they resolve those differences and how they go about those discussions is one of the great indicators in terms of whether those things that we're discussing are deal breakers or whether they're things that we can overcome and respectfully disagree about and come to a healthy, comfortable agreement about. So I don't know if there's a checklist as such that a person needs to go through, but there are certainly some big ticket items that we need to discuss in terms of ethics and values and finances and all those sorts of things. But unfortunately, if they were to be discussed just in the romance stage, sometimes they're glossed over and not actually addressed thoroughly enough for us to actually explore the differences that we have and work out how we're going to navigate through them.
So it's important for people to move past the romance stage in order to grow as a couple?
Yeah, because ideally, unfortunately, a lot of people end up getting married in that romance stage where everything is rosy, and then they actually hit those power struggle times after marriage, and then they've got nowhere to go. They've got to sit there and work through them. But if they're able to navigate through that power struggle stage and get to a stability stage where, as a couple, they have a rhythm and they're able to navigate through problems that come their way, and they're comfortable communicating their fears and their worries and their stresses as well as the positive things in the relationship, then they're ready for a commitment stage.
Sure. So moving on from this rosy, beautiful romance stage, I want to talk about arguing and fighting. So is it okay to argue but not fight? And what is the difference?
I was about to ask you what the difference is. I think there's certainly a difference between arguing and fighting. And I think it's important that when we're discussing a subject that we discuss the actual subject, that it doesn't turn into a personal attack. There's a very big difference between me saying, I think we need to go visit our family over the weekend, for example, to me saying, you never come with me when I go visit my family. My approach is different, and the issue that we're addressing is different. When I'm fighting, I'm actually attacking the other person. I'm telling them that they are the problem, that they are the reason that we have problems. Whereas if I'm actually discussing something, then I'm identifying the issue that I'd like to resolve, and that becomes our focus. And we find a way of achieving a solution for it. Or, like you're saying, if it's before marriage and it's a deal breaker, then we can comfortably say, well, this is something that we can't agree about, and it's something major in our lives, and maybe we need to part ways. But fighting happens when we actually start to attack the person rather than the subject or the issue at hand.
So sometimes arguing can be healthy.
I think arguing is important because it brings out our differing points of view. I think a couple who never disagree about anything, in some instances, aren't being completely open about everything, because there are no two people that are completely and perfectly compatible in every way, shape or form. I think where a relationship is healthy is that there's an element of vulnerability and honesty and rawness that needs to come out. And when that does come out, a lot of times people find that they have different views about different things.
Sure. Okay. I've got a question that came in from an audience member. They're asking, does this mean there is no romance past the romance stage?
Oh, absolutely not. Like I said, what I should have said is romance continues throughout the relationship. But the romance stage, when we're talking about the romance stage, it's not that, 5 or 10 years into the relationship that you're not still giving each other flowers or going out to dinner or spending weekends away together. Romance is an essential part of a relationship, and it needs to remain through the relationship. And even post having children, couples are often advised to make sure that they make the time and they have the time out away from their daily life to spend time together and to nurture their relationship. So no, the romance phase certainly continues, but maybe those tunnel vision rose-coloured glasses come off slightly. And what happens is we make a decision to remain in the relationship, not based on our false ideas of what's actually going on, but based on the true person that we see, knowing that there are some things that we don't agree about, some things we do agree about, and we're happy to continue, so that we enter into a relationship out of choice rather than tunnel vision.
Sure. We've got another question that came in from an audience member. They're asking, how can I overlook my partner's history and not bring it up again in our relationship?
Okay. It's important in a relationship for it to be a safe place. If I'm constantly bringing up the pain or the mistakes of another person and constantly reminding them of that, there are two issues here. One is, if we're talking about mistakes and things that have gone wrong, if God has forgiven them and they're thrown into the sea of forgetfulness, then who am I to keep bringing them back up? And God doesn't do that with us. He's gracious with us. And I think all relationships need grace. They need that place where we can actually move forward from our mistakes, because we all need that. We all need that from the most secure of attachments that we have with God, and we need it from others. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is a healthy marriage, a healthy relationship needs to be one that is a secure place, a place where I can actually come and talk honestly and openly and freely, and know that that's not going to get brought up time and time again. It's not going to be taken to anyone else, and it's not going to continue to be an issue. I think if I'm having a problem with something that's happened in my partner's past, then I need to spend some time with myself. I need to resolve that with myself, because bringing it up and constantly reminding them of it is really going to only damage the relationship, and it's going to create a larger gap between me and that person.
Okay. So if this happened before marriage and it's haunting the person, do you think it's best for them to walk away?
It's difficult to give that kind of advice in terms of when to say to someone it's best to walk away, but I'd certainly advise them to get some wise counsel, to sit down with a spiritual person or a counsellor or a psychologist or a priest that's trained in this area, and to actually talk about it and to get to a point where you're comfortable with the relationship and be able to move forward or not. Ideally, that's something that happens before marriage.
Sure. Okay. We're going to go for a quick break and we'll come back and we'll continue our discussion.
Okay.
Thank you. So just a reminder to our audience members, the phone number is 0416 551 292. Tonight is your opportunity to ask a question about keys to a good relationship. If you don't ask tonight, you're not going to know the answer to the question that's deep down in your heart. So please send us a text or give us a call and speak to our Christian counsellor that's here on the show tonight. Thank you.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.
Hi and welcome back to the episode Ask on CYC. Today's episode is about keys to a healthy relationship. If you have a question, please don't miss out. Send us a question to 0416 551 292 or give us a call and speak to our Christian counsellor here on board tonight. And remember, you'll be anonymous. Thank you. So moving on to this discussion about relationships. So the next question I want to ask you is about the physical needs. How important is physical needs in the construction of a relationship if they're not met?
Okay, so I'm making the assumption here that we're talking about a sexual relationship within the context of a marriage. And if that's what we're discussing, then there are some things we really need to understand. There are some myths that have been around for a long time. And one of them is that a sexual relationship within a marriage is something that stands in isolation. And that's actually completely untrue. A sexual relationship within the context of a marriage is very much related to every other aspect of the marriage. It's related to how the couple interact with one another, how comfortable and happy and secure they feel in the relationship. So it's important to understand that this is not something that we can kind of just pluck out of the relationship and look at in isolation. Having said that, this is an area that's often not discussed openly between a husband and a wife. And it's an area that needs to be open for honest and clear discussion between a husband and a wife. And it's also important that both understand that they have different needs and that they see a sexual relationship differently. So if I can share something with you, one of the major issues that husbands and wives often have in terms of the issue of sexual relations is that a lot of wives can't really get their head around the fact that they may, for example, be going through a very turbulent time in their relationship, but their husband may initiate a sexual relationship. And it has to do with the formula for sexual relations within a marriage, or for men and women rather. For men, they actually, within a marriage, for husbands, they initiate a sexual relationship with the aim of achieving intimacy in terms of emotional intimacy. And the sexual intimacy can occur before the emotional intimacy can occur, and they progress from one to the other. So for a lot of men, it makes sense that if they're going through problematic times, that he would reach out to his wife sexually in order to repair that emotional connection. For women, it's the opposite equation. Women actually need that emotional connection and that emotional intimacy in order to be able to enter into sexual intimacy with their husbands. So, and that's where the confusion happens, because at times the wife is feeling like, well, I'm not ready for this sexual relationship with my husband because of what we're going through, and can't quite understand why he would want to enter into this at maybe a problematic time in the relationship. And he's confused because he's thinking, but this is the way I'm trying to get close to her, and this is the way I'm trying to repair the relationship and achieve that emotional intimacy. But we are created that way for a reason. We're created differently so that we can complement one another. And I think if a couple can understand that and sit down and have an honest and open discussion about that, then they can come to a comfortable agreement about things. And he needs to know that she needs that emotional intimacy in order to be able to engage in in a sexual relationship with him. And she needs to know that when he does engage her in that way, he's not trying to use her, there's no evil or meanness about it. I'm talking, of course, within the context of a healthy, happy marriage, not an abusive relationship, because that's entirely different. That what he's actually doing is trying to achieve that emotional connection. And I think if husbands and wives understood that simple formula, it would resolve a lot of issues between them.
Sure. On the topic, is it important for couples to understand each other's love language?
Well, love language is not something that should be used to repair a relationship. Love languages are good and they have their place. And Gary Chapman, when he came out with the love languages, it was certainly pioneering in the sense that it was something that people hadn't spoken about in great depth before. But it's something that needs to be born out of a healthy relationship. We can't take a relationship which is in dire straits and very problematic and expect that because, for example, his love language is gifts, that coming home with an elaborate gift that would resolve the issues in the relationship. Rather, love languages are seen to complement and cement healthy relationships and validate the other person within the relationship. So yes, it's important to understand them, and it's important to have an awareness of what my husband or my wife like in terms of their love language and how they feel appreciated and loved, but it can't be the go-to tool in terms of repairing issues between them. Sure.
If something in our partner's personality trait bothers us and we're not happy with, should we try to change them, or should we try to change our perception of them?
Well, we can't change anyone. I often talk to young people about who is it that you can control and what is it that you can control. And ultimately, we can really only change ourselves. We can only really control what happens within ourselves and to ourselves. And I think many people have entered into relationships with the aim of fixing or improving the other person. And they've found that over time they've failed miserably because people don't want to be fixed and people don't want to be changed. People want to be accepted. And, it's a common human need across all of humanity that we want love, belonging, and acceptance. And so to feel rejected within the confines of the most intimate of relationships is a very damaging place to be. It's damaging to both the relationship and to the individual that's feeling like they're not good enough the way that they are. So I think we need to look within rather than at the other person when it comes to that one.
Sure. So we learn to sacrifice or just to be more accepting to this trait?
Well, it really depends on what the trait is and what kind of impact that it has on my life. I think it requires conversation and discussion. But I think the expectation that we will fix the other person or that they will be able to come in one day and they will stop, for example, their extroverted personality and stop being the life of the party when they go out and they meet with friends is an unfair expectation because that's part of who they are. There is also a difference between personality traits, characteristics, and abusive behaviours, for example. And so it's important to distinguish that and to know that if we're talking about a healthy behaviour that's part of a person's personality trait, then I don't think I have capacity to change it. If we're talking about an abusive behaviour, then maybe as a couple we need to seek some professional help.
Yeah, okay. We've got a question that came in from an audience member. They're asking, should couples look at counselling during their relationship? If so, how often?
I think counselling is important at all stages of relationship. There are many churches all over the world that have now put in place relationship courses and premarital seminars and all sorts of things to make sure that couples spend the time really getting to know each other and really questioning those subjects that they need to explore before they enter into a marriage. So it's important to receive good counsel, and it's important to talk to someone who is professionally trained in that area. Just like there are some things that you would, for example, if you were unwell, you would visit a doctor. There's no time limit or number of times as to when in your lifespan that you would go see a doctor. You may still, go to the priest and ask for the anointing of oil and ask them to pray for you, but you would still seek that professional advice. And the same is true for a relationship. A relationship is its own entity and requires care and attention and time. And a lot of the times, we're not always raised with healthy models of relationship. So we often need help in order to readjust our model of relating to the other person and learning how to have a healthier, more, fulfilling relationship with the other person. So there's no time limit, and I don't think we can put a number in terms of how many times we seek counsel in a relationship, or even before or after marriage.
Yeah, okay. So the next question from an audience member, they're asking, I'm not married, but I feel pressure to partake in sexual activity in the world that we live in. What should we do about it?
Yeah, that's definitely a common concern. If I can share with you something that I share with young people at the school, it's a very simple analogy. Because I think what often happens is if I'm convinced of something and I'm doing something because I'm convinced of it wholeheartedly, then it's no longer a temptation. It's when I've got those question marks about whether this is okay or whether this is not okay, that's when things become a temptation and become something that's difficult for me to say no to. So in this discussion I have with young people, I ask them a very simple question. So I'll ask you, Mina, how many people do you anticipate on marrying?
Just one.
One. When does that person become your wife?
At the altar.
Not while you're engaged,
No.
not beforehand. Up until the day that up until that moment that you walk into the church and receive the sacrament of marriage, that person has the potential to become someone else's husband or wife. And there are some things you just don't do with someone else's husband or wife. And there are actually some things you only want to do with your husband or wife. And if you think about it from that context, which is actually quite simple, but it's quite logical, who of us would want to marry or be with someone knowing that they have had that kind of relationship with anyone else? And who of us would want to walk around feeling like we've had that kind of relationship with someone else's husband or wife? But in reality, at any point in time where a sexual relationship occurs prior to that altar, prior to that sacrament being received, that's what we've effectively done. And I think if we look at this issue from a point of view of being convinced and knowing that what I stand for makes sense, then it's not as much of a struggle. And it makes sense to convince anyone else of that simple, example.
Sure. But at the same time, our church is a very forgiving church. So if anyone has fallen into this sin, the church is very accepting and forgiving to them when they come back. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. But if it's something that I'm contemplating and it's something that I'm thinking about, then maybe if I just look at it from a different angle, it makes it a little bit easier to not walk down that path.
Okay.
But of course, we are, like I said earlier, our sins get thrown into a sea of forgetfulness, and we are very lucky and blessed to be in a church and to know that we have that forgiveness available to us.
Okay. Next question that came from an audience member, they're asking, what should I do if my child catches my partner and I being intimate? Will my child need counselling?
It depends on how much they view and what happens and the age of the child, obviously. But I think it's always important to be honest with children and to speak to them at a level that's age appropriate, and to explain to them and to talk to them openly and honestly about what's happening. Obviously, we don't need to go into great detail, but again, it depends on the age and the length of time that that child was there and how much they witnessed. That determines what we say. But I think that is an important an important time, and it's a critical time. I think it's when parents deal with this issue inappropriately that at times children walk away with a distorted view, and that view can unfortunately stay for a very long period of time. So if anything, this is an opportunity to sit down with your child and to talk to them about marriage and the sanctity of marriage and the holiness of marriage, and maybe explain to them some things so that they're comfortable and that it doesn't become a traumatic or difficult experience for the child.
Okay. So the next question I want to talk to you about is probably one of the biggest issues in our Coptic Egyptian community. So intrusive parents, how can young couples deal with intrusive parents?
Okay. I think it's important to know that different people interact with their families in different ways, and that's okay, as long as both people agree on that level of interaction. You may have one person who's quite comfortable with seeing their family once every couple of weeks, having lunch with mum and dad every now and then, whereas you may have another person who quite comfortably will see their family members every day of the week and make sure that they have to call them every day and check on them and so on. And we have varying degrees everywhere in between one extreme to the other. What's important is not what boundaries I put, but what boundaries I agree with my husband or my future husband or wife about. And this is an area that's really important to be discussed openly and honestly before marriage, because it is something that does cause a lot of issues in relationships. So it's important that we're both on the same page, that we both agree that this is what we're both comfortable with. If we're both comfortable to see both sets of parents every day of the week, 7 days a week, we may be exhausted by the end of the week, but if that's what we agreed to and that's what we're both comfortable with, then that might be how we live our life. The issue happens where one person is of one thinking and the other person is of another, where one person wants to have very strict boundaries, for example, and the other person wants to have an open door system. So it's important that as a couple we have an agreement, because once we have an agreement and once we're united in that agreement, we can then put in place those boundaries and enforce them, not just with in-laws, but with anyone else that's in our life.
Sure. But visiting or seeing parents are maybe even more to that, where parents step in and help their own child make decisions in their relationship, whereas the other partner is not comfortable with this. That's the kind of intrusion I'm talking about.
Well, even that, it needs to be something that's discussed openly and honestly. And if it's something that a person is not comfortable about before marriage, a lot of times people think that once they get married that things automatically change. And that doesn't actually usually happen. What usually happens is people relax more, and so whatever was happening before marriage happens a bit more after marriage. So it's important that we don't ignore those things when they happen before marriage, and that again we agree on those boundaries, on what things are okay for us to get advice from and what things we're comfortable with in terms of doing on our own. Because there are some issues that parents may have more experience about, but at some point in time we need to form our own family unit and we need to be able to make those decisions for ourselves.
Okay. I want to talk about dating, because this is a very grey area in our Coptic community. It's become so grey that we don't have any guidance, or we don't have set rules in terms of dating, to the point where some of the youth would date secretly. The question I want to ask you is, this secret dating, is this healthy? The reason why I ask this is because when you date someone secretly, you don't see them amongst other people, so you don't see how they interact in public. So there's a certain aspect of them that you don't know about. So this secret dating, can this be healthy, and how do we move past this grey area?
I think it really depends on how we define dating and to what level we go to in the relationship under the heading of dating. If we were to think about that simple analogy I gave you earlier of the person that I'm with is potentially someone else's husband or wife, that can make things a lot easier in terms from a purity perspective and in terms of respecting our boundaries and knowing our limits in terms of dating. I think it's important that we spend time getting to know people before, spending that time under that heading of dating, as you like, before we actually enter into the next stage of a relationship. And I think it's important that we do that in a social setting. It's important that we do that amongst friends, amongst family, in open spaces. Unfortunately, people's perceptions are not something that are within our control. But I guess if you're asking my view about dating is that it needs to be something that happens socially, and it needs to be something, as you say, that's not done in secret and in private, but it's something that is open and visible. And that way, as you say, we're able to see that person in the context of being around other people as well, not just the two of us in isolation, where we don't really have a healthy interaction in that environment.
Sure. Okay, so I got a question that came in from an audience member. I'm actually not familiar with this. Maybe you might be familiar with it. They're asking, is there such thing as a 7-year itch?
There are a lot of people out there that talk about the 7-year itch, and what it actually talks about is where it's true for a lot of couples that have entered into a marriage in that romance stage. And what happens for a lot of them is they go through the first 7 years of their relationship navigating through the power struggles and navigating through the issues that they have. What tends to happen at that 7-year itch is that people get to that 7-year mark and think, oh my goodness, this is so much, what have I gotten myself into? But for the most part, if they can overcome those power struggles and those issues and start to get into a rhythm, they then go into a more stable relationship, a much more fulfilling relationship, because they've kind of tweezed out all those problems that they had in those first 7 years. So yes, the 7-year itch certainly does exist for some couples. For other couples, that 7-year itch gets moved back a little to 3 or 4 year itch, and for others it goes forward to a 10-year itch. But it's certainly there. I think a lot of couples get to a point where they have committed to that marriage while they're in that romance, and then have to go through those turbulent times after they've actually been married.
Okay, interesting. Next question I came in from an audience member. They're asking, what's the appropriate age difference between a man and a woman, and should the man be older?
I don't like the word should. In counselling, we're trained very early to not use the word should because it implies that we know better, and we don't. And a counsellor is meant to be an agent of change and someone who helps someone process whatever they're going through. So I don't know if there is a should, but what I do know is that it's important that the two are on the same wavelength, that they're able to relate to one another, they're able to interact with one another, they're able to have recreational activities together, they're able to plan their future in a way that's comfortable for both of them. Yes, traditionally the guy is older than the girl, but I know of many relationships where the opposite of that is true, and they're very healthy, loving relationships and flourishing relationships. So I don't think there's a set and hard rule, but I think it's really important, especially where there is a bigger age gap, that as a couple they sit down and they explore those issues in greater depth, because that age gap does tend to bear more of an impact later in life rather than earlier in life.
Sure. Okay, so I have one last question for you, and I know you've probably mentioned it over 15 times in this episode, but I really want to emphasize this question. How important is communication within couples?
Well, there's a lot of information out there about communication, and it talks about body language, demeanor, tone of voice, and all the rest of it. But ultimately, it's what we say that matters most. And if a couple can have a relationship where they can both be empathic, where they can try to be in the other person's shoes and feel what their life is like and respond empathically and with understanding to the other person, then they're able to calm any storm that comes up. Because all you need is one person who's frustrated about something and the other person responding to them empathically, and they will instantly calm down and will be able to resolve issues. A relationship where there is empathy, understanding, and the opportunity to be open and honest and vulnerable without fear is, I think, the most successful of relationships. So yes, it's paramount.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for your insight on this topic.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to the viewers who's tuned into today's episode, and thank you to all the questions that you sent through. Remember, unless you ask, you'll never know the answer to the question. So the phone number is 0416 551 292. Please keep tuned in to our episodes every Thursday at 8 p.m. Sydney time. I'm Mina Ibrahim from your CYC studios in Sydney. Good night and God bless.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.
The name CYC is very nice name. Nice name for here. CYC, musical name. And the efforts made by His Grace Bishop